Okay, in this video we'll go over Chapter 19, the respiratory system. Alright, first off, the definition for respiration. This is the process of exchanging gases between the atmosphere and the cells within the body, and it includes various steps. The first one is something that's more generic. It's ventilation. This is the movement of air in and out of the lungs. Nothing gets exchanged, it's just the moving of air in and out. That's what ventilation is. Next we have external respiration. This is the exchange of gases between the air in the lungs and the blood. And then you have the transport of gases between the blood and the lungs and the cells. And because before we had external respiration, now we have internal respiration. And this is the exchange of gases between the blood and the cells itself. So blood and the cells, it's more internal. It's going to be considered internal respiration. And then lastly, cellular respiration, the use of oxygen and the production of carbon dioxide. Hopefully you remember this term from either 168 or basic biology. Cells can't function without cellular respiration. The organs of the respiratory system are divided in one of two tracts, either the upper respiratory tract or the lower respiratory tract. And here are the structures that are found in each. For the upper, you have the nose, nasal cavity, the sinuses, and the pharynx. And for the lower, the larynx, trachea, the bronchial tree, and the lungs. And most of these make sense. The upper part, from the chest up, would be the upper, and from the chest down would be lower. The two structures that get confused with each other are the pharynx and the larynx. So L for larynx, L for lower. And the P for pharynx, and there's two P's in upper. But these two get commonly confused with where they are. Here's a generic illustration of the tract itself. The sinuses appear, the nostrils and mouth, larynx here, trachea here, and we'll branch off into the bronchi and then the lungs. I will start with the nose and then kind of work our way down into the lungs. The nose, filled with hairs to prevent entry of any larger particles into the lungs. Nasal cavity is the hollow space just behind the nose, and it's divided into halves by what's called the nasal septum. And that cavity, the nasal cavity, is lined with a thick layer of mucus, the mucous membrane, and this is there to help warm and moisten the air, and also to help filter the air. The sinuses, the air-filled spaces within the maxillary, frontal, ethmoid, and sphenoid bones of the skull. If you've ever had a sinus infection, you know exactly where these are. Their mucous membrane is continuous with the lining of the nasal cavity. And the sinuses are there to help reduce the weight of the skull, because if the sinuses were filled with bone, your skull would be even heavier than it already is. So you need that space there to help make your head lighter, and also serve as a resonant chamber for your voice to help echo or amplify the voice. Here's an illustration that you'll see again in lab. Frontal sinus here, right between the eyes. Sphenoid sinus right here, and we'll talk about these sections here in a second. Alright, next we'll move on to the pharynx. The pharynx is a posterior to the oral cavity between the nasal cavity and larynx. We talked about this in the last chapter with the digestive system. Now, the pharynx serves as a passageway for both food and air. Food going down through the esophagus down to the stomach, and air passing down from the nasal cavity into the larynx. And the pharynx has three subdivisions, and the name tells you what it's very close to. You have the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. Nasopharynx is just behind the nose, the nasal cavity. Oropharynx is just behind the mouth, oral cavity. And the laryngopharynx just next to the larynx. Okay, the larynx is an enlargement of the airway that's just above the trachea and just below the pharynx, made up of a large network of different types of cartilage and different types of muscles. And we'll only talk about one particular type of cartilage here. That's the thyroid cartilage. This is what protrudes in front of the neck, forming the Adam's apple. This is much more prominent in males than females. That's the part that actually will jut out in the front of the throat. That's the thyroid cartilage or the Adam's apple. This is how it looks from the front. Almost looks like a shield, almost kind of jutting out here. And it's the posterior view here. Alright, one other type of cartilage that we'll mention, the epiglottic cartilage. This is the only one of the cartilages found here in the larynx that is elastic cartilage, not hyaline cartilage. So epiglottic is the only one that's elastic. And this will help form the epiglottis, which is a flap-like structure that when you swallow, your tongue will actually push the epiglottis down to cover the larynx. This will prevent food from going into the airway or to your lungs. When people eat food too fast or eat too much at once, and you start to choke on your food, and people say, well, food went down the wrong way, this is what they mean. If the epiglottis doesn't close in time or close completely enough, food, instead of going down to your esophagus, into your stomach, will go down into your trachea, into your lungs. That's why you start to cough and choke. Alright, the larynx has two horizontal folds made above connective tissue and different types of muscle. The upper part, the upper folds, are called the false vocal cords because they do not produce any sound, and the lower folds do produce sound. They're called the true vocal cords. And how the vibrations of these cords are produced will produce different types of pitch. When they vibrate faster, you'll get a higher pitch. When they vibrate slower, you'll get a lower pitch. Alright, and here's a upper view here. This is when it's closed and when it's open. These two obviously are illustrations. This one is real. So these folds here and here are false. They don't make any sound. But these here are the true vocal cords here. Those are what will vibrate and open and shake. When someone is intubated in a hospital, this is where the respirator is going, right down here. You have to make sure that the true vocal cords are open. That's where that will lead down to the trachea and down into the lungs. Right, the trachea, also known as the windpipe, very flexible tube. It's about 12 centimeters long, and it's just in front of the esophagus. This is what you can feel in the front of your throat. That's the trachea. It's also lined with a mucous membrane that has cilia on it to help clean and filter the incoming air. And it's held open by a type of hyaline cartilage that's in the shape of a C. That's why you can feel it in the very front of your throat. It's held open by the C-shaped cartilage. Okay. Right here, thyroid cartilage forming the Adam's apple for males. That's the larynx. And then here's the trachea. You see these little individual, from this view, almost look like donuts. These are the cartilaginous rings. It's the trachea here, and it will branch off into right and left bronchi here, which we'll talk about next. Okay, the bronchial tree is what will consist of very branched airways leading from the trachea, and it will get continuously smaller and smaller and smaller to get down to the very, very, very small sacs in the lungs called alveoli, and they're only one cell thick. The first branch are the primary bronchi, both right and left, going into the right and left lung. And like I said, these will get further smaller and smaller. And each of those has their own formal name, but we'll go over the more generic names. From the trachea, you have the right-left primary bronchi. After primary, you have secondary bronchi, and then tertiary, and then you end up with alveoli, the very thin-walled sacs where the actual gas exchange in the lungs happens. Again, here's the trachea here. The first branch here, that'd be primary bronchi, or a bronchus would be singular. And the secondary or lobar, and then tertiary. Each of these getting smaller and smaller and smaller till you get to these little clusters, almost look like grapes on a vine. These are all alveoli. And the singular will be alveolus. This is how the bronchial tree looks when it's dyed with plastic. This is how complex it is. Fairly large here, and a little bit smaller, all the way down to these really thin, very small extensions. The alveoli, they are there to provide a very large surface area and a very thin epithelial tissue. The more surface area you have, the more gas exchange you can have, and much more quickly. And the whole way that gas exchange happens, both for carbon dioxide and oxygen, is from simple diffusion. Remember from hopefully 168 or biology, diffusion is material moving from an area of high concentration to low concentration. And this is true for both oxygen and carbon dioxide. So this is how blood will get rid of carbon dioxide and how it will take in oxygen from simple diffusion. Okay, we'll take a close-up look at one of these. The bronchi getting smaller and smaller to these little branches, and this is just one alveolus from this little cluster here. And I'll take a closer look at this. Alright, this material here is the air in the lungs. Okay, you have the venous blood flow here. Remember, it's being pumped from the right ventricle through the pulmonary arteries going into the lungs. And from here, you have much more carbon dioxide in this blood than there is in the air, and much more oxygen here in the air than there is in the vessel. So this will diffuse from here to here. That will diffuse here to here. So carbon dioxide will go into your lungs, and then we will breathe it out. And oxygen will go from your lungs into the blood and go back to the heart through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, and of course the left ventricle, then aorta, and then out the rest of the body. So all this happens by simple diffusion. More of this here, so it diffuses into the lungs to be breathed out. More oxygen here, gets put into the blood to go back to the heart. That's why this is red, and I'm showing there's oxygen here. And going back to the heart to be pumped to the rest of the body. Here's how one looks. This is a real image from a microscope, not a drawing. This is a real one. Is there an alveolar sac here? One there, and one bronchiole. Alright, next we'll talk about the lungs. Of course, you have two, right and left. They're spongy and kind of cone-shaped and fairly soft, found in the thoracic cavity. The right lung has 3 lobes. The left lung only has 2. The left lung needs to make a little bit more room because the heart's there. That gets kind of squished down. And this term we mentioned before already, the hilum. This is a generic term that refers to any indented area where lymphatic vessels and nerves and major vessels enter a structure. So this is where the bronchi enter each lung, through the hilum. And we'll see this term again when we talk about the kidneys also. Okay. Of course, here's the rib cage, sternum, the clavicles. Of course, there's a trachea up here. And this one actually mentions the names of the lobes of the lung, but we won't talk about those. Alright, the lungs are covered with a double membrane called the pleura. And it's very thin, and it has, like I said, 2 layers, but it's actually one very long membrane that doubles back on itself at the hilum. And I'll show you how that looks here next. And it's described with 2 separate names, depending on where that membrane is. You have the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura. Now these terms, visceral and parietal, are also very generic terms. They describe where a membrane is. So this is not particular just for the lungs. When a membrane is parietal, it's going to line a cavity. When something is visceral, it's going to line the organ itself, actually touch the organ. So for the parietal pleura, this will line the inside of the rib cage and the diaphragm. And for the visceral pleura, actually contacts and covers the lungs. Okay. And between those 2 layers, remember the one membrane kind of doubles back on itself, there's a very, very small space. That's called the pleural cavity. Now in this cavity you'll find a fluid that helps the layers slide by one another and helps the lungs to be able to inflate and deflate without rubbing on other tissues and damaging either one. So here's an illustration, and we'll start over here, and we'll follow the red line first. This would be the parietal pleura. This would line the rib cage and also the diaphragm right over here. Remember, the diaphragm is just below the lungs. And as it circles back around, it will get back to the hilum, and then it will double back and actually contact the lungs. So that's why this is in blue, and that's the visceral pleura. All the way back over meeting back at the hilum. So this is all one really long membrane that wraps around the lungs twice. Once for the cavity, once for the lungs itself. Of course, this is true for both right and left. And here, the space between the two, and this is much more exaggerated than it really is. It's a very, very small space. Between those two membranes, you'll find the pleural space, or pleural cavity. Breathing mechanism. Like we mentioned before, ventilation, the movement of air inside the body down to the alveoli, moving air in and out of the lungs. The actions that are responsible for these movements are inhalation and exhalation. And their formal names are inspiration and expiration. So, inhalation, breathing in, inspiration, exhaling, breathing out, expiration. So when you see these two terms, that's all they mean. Inspiration is breathing in, expiration, breathing out. Now the key word on here, this whole slide, is this: pressure. Air is moved both in the lungs and both out of the lungs based on the difference in pressure. Air is actually pushed into your lungs, and the air is actually pushed out of your lungs due to pressure. And the air moves based on a concentration gradient, much like we talked about with diffusion. You're going from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. So that's how air technically gets pushed in your lungs and then pushed out of your lungs. Now, pressure and volume of gases anyway, are going to be inversely related. So when one goes up, the other one goes down. And for those of you that have had chemistry or physics, that's referred to as Boyle's law. So when one of these goes up, the other one goes down. And here's a way to think about that. As you're listening to this, take a deep breath in. And as you do that, your volume capacity of your lungs goes up. That's why your chest expands and your lungs are filling with air. As that volume goes up, the pressure will go down. And when you breathe out, it's the exact opposite. So that's what's referred to as inversely related or inversely proportional. Okay, and for inspiration or inhaling, like I just mentioned, when the diaphragm is signaled to contract, it will flatten out. As it flattens out, you have more room in your thoracic cavity for the lungs to expand, so that volume will increase, and that will decrease the pressure. And from there, atmospheric pressure will force air into your lungs. And I'll show you some numbers on how that works. Okay. This is how it normally looks when you're not breathing. The pressure within the lungs is 1 atmosphere, or 760 millimeters of mercury. When you breathe in, the diaphragm will contract or flatten out. The volume will go up, but the pressure will go down. So outside the lungs, it's 760. Inside the lungs, it's now 758. Air goes from higher pressure to lower pressure. So air is actually pushed into your lungs. Okay. And for breathing out, it's going to be the opposite. What helps the lungs to recoil is the elastic tissue and also the surface tension in the alveoli. When you breathe out, the pressure in your lungs goes to 761. So 761 is higher than 760, so air is pushed out of your lungs. So basically this, but in reverse. But the key thing here to remember is air moves by a difference in pressure, going from higher pressure to lower pressure. Alright, next we'll talk about the respiratory volumes and capacities. Different degrees of effort will be defined by different volumes and different functions of your lungs. There are 4 types of volumes and there are 4 types of capacities. A capacity is really just 2 or more volumes added together. And these terms are fairly long, fairly confusing, and hopefully I'll try to explain them as clear as I can. And they also have their own abbreviations, which is perfectly fine to use. Just like when we talked about the hormones, the endocrine system, perfectly fine to use the acronyms as opposed to the full term. Alright, the first one, tidal volume, or TV. This is the amount of air that moves in and out of the lungs at rest, what you're doing right now. So think of the tide at the beach. It comes in and out as a nice, calm pace. So when you're just sitting there doing nothing, the air going in and out of your lungs is the tidal volume. The next one, IRV, inspiratory reserve volume. This is the amount of air that can be forcibly inhaled in addition to your normal tidal volume. So this is taking a deep breath in. So you're forcing more air into your lungs than what you normally would. So that's the IRV. Opposite of that, ERV, expiratory reserve volume. The amount of air that can be forcibly exhaled in addition to tidal volume is taking a deep breath out. So again, inspiratory, breathing in, expiratory, breathing out. Residual volume, this is the amount of air that's in your lungs at all times. Your lungs basically serve as balloons in your chest, and they have to be inflated for gas exchange to happen. So there's always some amount of air that's always going to be in your lungs that you can never get rid of. The only way that this air can be deleted or depleted from your lungs is if there's an injury. This is what happens when your lungs collapse. From, say, stab wound or gunshot wound. When your lungs collapse, it's because this volume of air is already gone. But in normal situations, you can't get rid of this amount of air. The next one, VC, vital capacity. Maximum volume of air a person can inhale and exhale. So this is taking a deep breath in and then a deep breath out. And again, capacity is 2 or more volumes, so vital capacity is this, IRV plus ERV. Deep breath in, deep breath out. Next one, IC, inspiratory capacity. The maximum volume a person can inhale after a resting expiration. So after you breathe out, the most you can breathe in. Okay. Next one, FRC, functional residual capacity. The volume of air that remains in the lungs after a resting expiration. So after you are done breathing out from a tidal volume expiration, the air that's left in your lungs. And of course, the last one, TLC, total lung capacity. This is everything. The air that's always going to be in your lungs, plus everything that you can inhale or exhale. All the air that your lungs can hold is TLC. Now this graphic has everything that we talked about kind of put on one graph, and it's hard to find one of these that isn't terribly confusing, and I've found one of the better ones. So over here, the tidal volume, normal breathing in and out at rest. The IRV, deep breath in here. Residual volume, the amount of air that's always going to be there. Total lung capacity, all of these. And I wouldn't ask this graphic on a test or an exam, but this is to kind of put all those terms together on one image. Alright, next we'll talk about the alveolar gas exchange. The portion of the wall of the alveoli is made up of cells that secrete a special lipoprotein called surfactant. This will help keep the air sacs inflated and wet so gases can be exchanged faster. Now, surfactant is good, but when you have too much of this, it's a problem. This is what people have cystic fibrosis, or CF. Too much of this is made to the point where it gets, instead of being nice and wet, it becomes almost like a very thick mucus, and it will actually cause the alveoli to collapse. And when they collapse, they can't work. And when they can't work, then they can't be regenerated. So that's why CF is so much of an issue for respiratory as a respiratory problem. And the actual site of gas exchange between the air in the alveoli and the blood occurs between the border of the alveolar capillary membrane. That space is called the respiratory membrane. So that's where gases actually get exchanged. Capillary membrane and the alveolar membrane. And here's how one looks. These are red blood cells squeezing between some alveoli here. Alveolar space, alveolar space. This is how thin they are. And again, it's a real image, it's not a drawing. Alright, oxygen transport. We mentioned this in passing a few chapters ago. Almost all oxygen is carried in the blood bound to hemoglobin in a form called oxyhemoglobin. So hemoglobin plus oxygen, oxyhemoglobin. And there's some factors that will help increase the release of this oxygen. There's a lowering of partial pressure of oxygen that's currently in your body. More will get released to balance that out. And there's a spike in partial pressure of carbon dioxide. If blood becomes more acidic, or there's an increase in temperature. Any of these four and others will cause oxygen to be released from oxyhemoglobin. Alright, that brings us to the end of this chapter, the respiratory system. Like always, if you have any questions, please ask, or post them to the discussion board.